of Mice and Men. Chapter 4, Part 3. Lenny watched her, his mouth half open. Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity of the Negro. But a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backward. I had enough, he said angrily. You ain't wanted here. We told you you ain't. And I tell you, you got floozy ideas about what us guys amounts to. You ain't got enough sense in that chicken head to even see we ain't stiffs. Suppose you get us canned. Suppose you do. You think we'll hit the highway and look for another lousy two-bit job like this? You don't know that we got our own ranch to go to and our own house. We ain't got to stay here. We got a house and chickens and fruit trees and a place 100 times prettier than this. And we got friends, that's what we got. Maybe there was a time when we was scared of getting canned, but we ain't no more. We got our own land and it's ours, and we can go on it. Curly's wife laughed at him. Baloney, she said. I seen too many you guys. If you had 2 bits in the world, why you be getting 2 shots of corn with it and sucking the bottom of the glass? I know you guys. Candy's face had grown redder and redder, but before she was done speaking, he had control of himself. He was the master of the situation. I might have knew, he said gently. Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. We know what we got, and we don't care whether you know it or not. So maybe you just better scatter along now, 'cause Curly maybe ain't gonna like his wife out in the barn with us bindle stiffs. She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her. And she looked longest at Lenny, until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly she said, "Where'd you get them bruises on your face?" Lenny looked up guiltily. "Who, me?" "Yeah, you." Lenny looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. "He got his hand caught in a machine," he said. Curly's wife laughed. "Okay, machine. I'll talk to you later. I like machines." Candy broke in. "You let this guy alone. Don't you go messing around with him." "I'm going to tell George what you says. George won't have you messing around with Lenny. Who's George? She asked. The little guy you come with? George smiled happily. That's him, he said. That's the guy, and he's going to let me tend the rabbits. Well, if that's all you want, I might get a couple of rabbits myself. Crook stood up from his bunk and faced her. I had enough, he said coldly. You got no rights coming in a colored man's room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. Now you just get out and you get out quick. If you don't, I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more. She turned on him in scorn. Listen, black guy, she said. You know what I can do to you if you open your trap? Crook stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down in his bunk and drew into himself. She closed in on him. You know what I could do? Crook seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. Yes, ma'am. Well, you keep your place then, black guy. I could get you strung upon a tree so easy it ain't even funny. Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego. Nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, yes, ma'am, and his voice was toneless. For a moment, she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. But Crook sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. She turned at last to the other two. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. If you was to do that, we'd tell, he said quietly. We'd tell about you framing crooks. Tell and be darned, she cried. Nobody'd listen to you, and you know it. Nobody'd listen to you. Candy subsided. No, he agreed, nobody'd listen to us. Lenny whined, I wish George was here. I wish George was here. Candy stepped over to him. Don't you worry none, he said. I just heard the guys coming in. George will be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet. He turned to Curly's wife. You better go home now, he said quietly. If you go right now, we won't tell Curly you was here. She appraised him coolly. I ain't sure you heard nothing. Better not take no chances, he said. If you ain't sure, you better take the safe way. She turned to Lenny. I'm glad you bust up Curly a little bit. He got it coming to him. Sometimes I like to bust him myself. She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, and some of the horses snorted and stamped their feet. Crook seemed to come slowly out of the layers of protection he had put on. Was that the truth, what you said about the guy's comeback, he asked. Sure, I heard him. Well, I didn't hear nothing. The gate banged, Candy said, and he went on. Good grief, Curly's wife can move quiet. I guess she had a lot of practice, though. Crooks avoided the whole subject now. Maybe you guys better go, he said. I ain't sure I want you in here no more. A colored man gotta have some rights, even if he don't like 'em. Candy said, that witch did not have said that to you. It wasn't nothing, Crooks said dully. You guys coming in and setting made me forget. What she says is true. The horses snorted out in the barn and the chains rang and a voice called, Lenny! Oh, Lenny, you in the barn? It's George, Lenny cried. And he answered, Here, George, I'm right here. In a second, George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. What you doing in Crook's room? You hadn't ought to be here. Crooks nodded. I told 'em, but they come in anyways. Well, why didn't you kick 'em out? I didn't care much, said Crooks. Lenny's a nice fella. Now Candy aroused himself. Oh, George, I've been figuring and figuring. I got it doped out how we can even make some money on them rabbits. George scowled. I thought I told you not to tell nobody about that. Candy was crestfallen. Didn't tell nobody but Crooks. George said, Well, you guys get out of here. Good grief, seems like I can't go away for a minute. Candy and Lenny stood up and went toward the door. Crooks called, Candy. Huh? Remember what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs? Yes, said Candy, I remember. Well, just forget it, said Crooks. I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that. Well, okay, if you feel like that. Good night. The three men went out of the door. As they went through the barn, the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat on his bunk and looked at the door for a moment, and then he reached for the liniment bottle. He pulled out his shirt in the back, poured a little liniment in his pink palm, and reaching around, he slowly fell to rubbing his back.